Yeah, my name is Camilla Klebner. I work as a senior researcher at the ZSI, something called the Center for Social Innovation in Vienna, and it's my great pleasure to chair this third webinar in the Nature Society webinar series that we are doing this year. Yeah, we're very excited to have actually three speakers today, which is Professor Davies, who is Professor of Geography at Trinity College in Dublin, Professor Teis Hansen, Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the University of Copenhagen, and also Dr. Stine Madsen, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Copenhagen. So this is part of the, as I said, Geography of Sustainability Transitions webinar series. This is actually the third installment overall, and also the third webinar today. It was my great pleasure actually to co-organize this year's series with Christian Binz from EAWAC, who is also here today, and Markus Steen from SINTEF, who is also here today. And we're very, very competently supported by Sophia Olbo from EAWAC and Marie Wardeborg from SINTEF as well. So we're very grateful for that, actually. I'm gonna move those slides. So yeah, just a quick kind of overview or introduction why we're actually doing this webinar. Is this common perception amongst quite a few of us that actually this idea of what is actually nature is quite absent in work in economic geography and also sustainability transitions research. So it's a question of kind of how can we integrate nature, especially conceptually, but in general into our work. What do we actually mean by that, and what would be the implications for then going into empirical work? So, of course, you could see or understand nature as a natural resource solely, but also the biophysical environment. Of course, there's the ecological systems aspect, but of course also, as you heard last time, just kind of materiality, this idea of the stuff that is out there and how do we work with that. Then, of course, there's a role attributed to nature. It could be then basically a resource base and also a condition for potential transition or restriction in a way even. We would have to think about how we can integrate it into ideas about transition processes, but it can also be a kind of part of the outcome of transition processes. So the aim of this webinar itself is actually just to give a kind of overview of what are existing and also newly proposed perspectives within this emerging field of the geography of sustainability transitions, and then to bring together different scholars in the different fields that are actually interested in this issue. So what we also try to do is to invite scholars with expertise in related fields to possibly draw some kind of conceptual inspiration from each other, ideally. And it's also a first step, hopefully, towards developing a broader research agenda around this issue of nature-society relations at this interface. So what it is, we had a kickoff on the 27th of March with myself and colleague Arlen Dahl Andersen, just kind of setting the scene a bit. We had last webinar on the 10th of April with Rune Nunez and Hui Gong going into this matter of kind of materiality. Today, we are looking at the governance of land use and bioeconomies with Anna Davies and Stine Madsen and Teis Hansen. And then the final webinar of the series will be taking place on the 22nd of May, where we look at political ecology perspectives and what we can actually gain from there, together with Mary Lohan and Gavin Bridge, and very much looking forward to that as well, of course. So in terms of what could be potential next steps, of course, there will be a Geography of Sustainability Transitions track at this year's IST in Lisbon. I can also now actually confirm that there will be a Nature Society Interactions related special session at the 8th Geography of Innovation Conference in Budapest in January next year. There will, I guess, or I'm pretty sure there will be a GeoST track at next year's IST as well. And of course, we're also considering to potentially bring out a special issue in relation to this subject. So today's speakers, I don't really want to take away from the two of you. So I'm not going to say too much about that, but basically today you're looking into this issue of governance of land use and bioeconomies. Just a few practical issues though before we start, just so we kind of on the same page here. Just so you're aware, we are recording these webinars and they will be made available on the GOST website. So please do mute yourself and also switch off the camera. This is also to save on bandwidth and yeah, helping each other out a bit on this. Please do use the Q&A box that is available in the Teams software to type in any questions. Also, you can actually upvote questions if you have any, or if you find them interesting. And if you, of course, post on social media about this session, please do tag in the Geography of Transitions LinkedIn page that we have now, and that you can also join. Right, so with this, I think I would really like to introduce our first speaker today, Professor Anne Davies. Anne Davies is a professor of geography at Trinity College Dublin and also the director of the Environmental Governance Research Group there. She has a background in environmental governance and sustainability studies, and her research explores the socio-political and spatial dimensions of sustainability transitions, focusing on topics such as urban nature, environmental policy, and citizen engagement. She also teaches across a range of interdisciplinary programs related to geography, sustainability, and environmental studies. And with that, Anna, I want to unshare my screen and invite you to share yours and hand over the floor to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the webinar series. Can you just give me a thumbs up that you can see the slides okay? Is that good? I can see you. Thank you so much. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here today to reflect on how the identification and governance of meanings and values of non-human nature has changed in recent decades. There's been significant developments, but many familiar problems persist, and I'll draw on some emergent ideas from a collaborative research project that I'm involved with called the Naturescapes project. This is led by Harriet Bulkley in Utrecht, and I'm working directly with Holly Marriott-Webb, an anthropologist, and Iris Muller, a physical geographer and coastal geomorphologist. And this interdisciplinary team has led to many rich discussions about values, meaning, science, and sustainable futures. But in this short talk, I'm going to reflect on what has changed and what remains the same in debates about values and meanings of urban nature in particular. So going back more than 25 years, I was conducting a PhD examining environmental values and the UK planning system. And fundamentally, I was interested in what people valued about their local environments and why. And this research took place at a time when Local Agenda 21, a key outcome of the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, designed to promote sustainable development at the local level, was really shaping governance architecture and practice. And part of my research took place in Luton, a large town 35 miles from London, which has an industrial heritage, was centre of the hat making for centuries, and hence the nickname of its football club, the Hatters. And it was a home of Vauxhall Motors for more than 100 years, with its operations unfortunately closing their doors later this month. It was then, when I did the research, and remains one of the most ethnically diverse towns in the UK. And I interviewed public, private, civil society actors and held multiple citizens focus groups to uncover meanings and values people held with respect to their lived environments. And this revealed a bundle of sometimes conflicting views and experiences, but also enduring values. So what did I find? Well, I found that the use of deliberative focus groups were productive in providing relatively safe spaces for participants to articulate their values and experiences, but they weren't representative of the wider population. But nonetheless, despite their diversity, the range of values articulated across public focus groups were surprisingly similar at a high level. They tended to be more qualitative in nature than those articulated by actors in the planning system, and cultures, emotions, and memories were key to interpreting meanings and shaping their values. My concern at the end of the research was that we might be getting better at capturing a plurality of values, but whether these values would ultimately get included or not in decision making was unclear. So my journey in academia took me away from Luton and took me to London, where I was able to kind of engage with international work on this tricky issue of environmental values with the Carnegie Council. And then I moved to Dublin, where I was encountering new spaces and issues. And in 2001, when I moved, environmental values were barely on the agenda in Ireland, apart from an embryonic natural capital grouping that was led initially by ecologists who felt that adopting the language of economists was really the only way to get their issues on the agenda. And this work promoted an anthropocentric, instrumental view of nature, converting living things to assets and stocks. But the Celtic Tiger boom that had created never before seen wealth for many in Ireland was bringing with it many pressures for landscapes and infrastructures, generating lots of conflict over land use and bioeconomies. And in response, I led futuring research that employed a kind of participatory process of backcasting in an attempt to give space really for more inclusive and less adversarial discussions about transitions to more sustainable futures in Ireland. And while the Irish state has become much more open to public participation in recent years, being a leader really in supporting citizens' assemblies around climate change and biodiversity loss, we've seen few changes trickling down through to policy implementation. This has created a space for us in the Naturescapes project to revisit what and whose values and meanings are known and which count in decision making, specifically around nature-based solutions at the urban scale. And while there's no time today to go into detail about the Naturescapes project itself, in brief, it's a large consortium project examining nature-based solutions at the urban scale internationally, including European case studies, but also beyond that. So it has multiple dimensions and international partners, academic and otherwise. Please do check the project website. I'm happy to answer any questions on the wider project as well. But my role specifically in the project, along with Holly and others, is to untangle who gets to shape decisions about nature-based solution developments and on what grounds. A very similar question then to what I posed in Luton back in the 1990s. So my question was, have we moved on at all in terms of governing urban nature in the last 25 years? I think, there are differences. The framing of nature as a solution, for one, for human problems is, of course, a key theme here. And nature-based solutions are seen as an integral part of the bioeconomy, particularly within broad sustainability and circular economy frameworks, because they use natural processes and ecosystems, whether that's forests, wetlands, green roofs, or urban parks, to deliver benefits. And new international statements on the assessment of values have emerged, particularly the work of IP Best shown on this slide, which emphasises the significance of relational as well as instrumental and intrinsic values, the binary over which had dominated historical debates. And moving beyond values, we are using an imaginaries framing in Naturescapes, allowing us to uncover how people envisage, relate to, and construct nature in urban environments, not just as physical entities, but as something which is socially and culturally meaningful. And these developments have occurred alongside new sites, spaces, and mechanisms for engaging people and eliciting values, driven in part by efforts to ensure a just transition. This desire for greater inclusion has stimulated many creative interventions for engagement, from citizens' assemblies to immersive soundscapes, and from our exhibition to climate cabarets. And the work of the Climate Imaginaries project based in Sweden is fantastic here. So we have, as a result, a richer picture now, I would say, than of what people's lived environments mean to them and what they value about them more than ever before. And this is great. Right? However, the issue has been conceived primarily as one of a methodological problem, and if we were only better able to capture the meanings and values of everyday encounters with nature, then policy will be able to accommodate them. But I see there are two kind of key problems with this. One, that the citizen engagement that has been rolled out has tended to be conceived of as an event, a one-off, rather than a process to be embedded in decision-making infrastructures. And also it assumes that decision-making actors and institutions and the conventions and logics that they adopt can be accommodated and can be evaluated and fairly incorporated into the plurality of values through these mechanisms. So Evan, as noted by Sam Campbell and Laura Gurney from the University of Waikato in New Zealand, there's a need to dig down even further into what shapes people's relationships with nature to address quite ontological questions of the many ways of knowing and being in the world. And they use an example. An instrumental value holder and a relational value holder disagree over the construction of a dam on a wild river. While one values the river as its potential to generate energy, the other believes that conserving the river is the right thing to do. Nonetheless, while they disagree on the values, they still agree on the subject of their disagreement. the river. However, in a different scenario, an instrumental values holder may wish to clear a forest to gain timber, but a relational, more spiritual values holder may want to protect a god who happens to reside in that same place. So while a conflict of values exists here, there's no agreement on what or who the values relate to. Is it the forest? Is it the god? The IP-BEST framework provides the scaffolding for us to classify values, but it doesn't tell us how to compare or accommodate them in decision-making. And we experienced similar tensions in relation to North Bull Island in Dublin, a case study in the Naturescapes project. So North Bull Island was formed as nature's response to 19th century engineering works to improve shipping access to Dublin port. The North Bull Wall was built in 1825 and it runs 3 kilometres out into the bay. And this altered the tidal currents, causing sand and sediments to accumulate beyond the wall and caused a sand spit to form and eventually an island. And by the late 19th century, vegetation like marron grass had stabilised those dunes, allowing for a more permanent land feature to form. It's now a nature reserve and has been partially refamed as a nature-based solution in recent years because of its protective capacity for the houses that are along the coast. So the official imaginary of North Bull Island as a sanctuary for wild birds is reinforced through the visitor access management plan that's shown on this slide, which sets out the rules and expectations for visitor behaviour, revealing both how management thinks about nature on the island and how everyday values or ways of interacting with it should take place. In this, dog walkers and their dogs are the problem for this official imaginary, disturbing habitats and bird behaviour. And in an effort to avoid conflict, a sacrificial zone has been identified to try and contain these impacts. However, there are ongoing conflicts at the site are not just between conservationists and the public, there are also tensions amongst scientists themselves. So, for example, a rare plant, Petalophyllum, was found on the island and botanists called for it to be protected from any disturbance. However, the area was also being used by pupping seals, who were also seen as a vital part of the wider ecosystem. So in the end, a pathway was sealed off to prevent human disturbance, but the plant was left to live or die alongside the seals. Similarly, the nature-based solution value of North Bull Island, as seen by the manager of the site, is primarily seen as protecting these houses along the coast, the dunes on it being a key barrier, protecting that land from sea surges and extreme weather conditions. And rabbits are seen as key to helping these dunes solidify through their grazing habitats. But they were frowned upon by the botanists as non-native species that also graze on the rare plants that they might encounter. So even as a relatively new nature, North Bull Island supports different notions of what an urban nature is, what it's for, and how it should be. And more than just ontological divergences about what nature is conceived to be by humans, it also raises the question of considering the active involvement of nature, whether that's dogs or ducks, pups or rabbits, plants or dune formation, in shaping human understandings and interactions with it. So in revisiting my work on meanings and values of urban nature through the Naturescapes project and feeling a bit disappointed, say, with the progress made, since my work back in the 1990s, I try to take comfort from the words of Donna Haraway in particular, who urges us to stay with the trouble. Her work on relational ethics of kin-making and care across species and generations is grounded in a kind of humility towards the messiness of coexistence, and that really helps me. I think it allows us to describe the ways in which humans value their relationships with nature as distinct from the kind of tangible material benefits which may be derived from its use. And for all the scientific and technical advances we've seen over the past 25 years, particularly in terms of developing new mechanisms to elicit values in all their richness, the art of allocating value in decision-making still remains unclear. So to conclude, value tensions are, as seen by others like Ives and Kendall back in 2014, not problems to eliminate, but dynamics to work with. And this is important because, and returning to my starting point, what matters in societies is what goes without saying, which is determined by tradition. And as Terry Eagleton said, tradition is always silent, not least about itself. So thanks for your attention.
Well, Stine, surprising me. Thank you for staying so well within time, and thank you so much for a hugely interesting and inspiring talk. Actually, also I really like this thinking of last time's webinar. Bruno Nurse actually pointed us to thinking more about the hyphen between nature and society, so these relations between nature and society and how we actually relate as humans and as society to nature. And I think this is exactly what you actually have done in your talk today, so this is really nice to see. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Please, audience, do enter your questions for Anna into the Q&A box. And in the meantime, I think we will move on to the second talk today. And I will move on to Stine Madsen and Teis Hansen. And maybe, Stine, you can bring on your slides. Yes. Stine Madsen is a postdoctoral researcher, and also Teis Hansen is a professor of innovation and entrepreneurship at the University of Copenhagen. Both have backgrounds in innovation studies and sustainability transitions. Their research explores governance, agency, and spatial dynamics in socio-technical systems, commonly with a focus on challenges such as plastic governance, transformative innovation policy, and regional pathways to sustainable development. With that, Stine and Teis, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, is the presentation in full screen now?
I have a black screen.
Yeah, I have a white
not everyone
screen.
else.
Okay, we'll try again. Let's see. You have
Earlier was fine.
Earlier was
It's
fine.
not helping.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah, that's nearly there. Presentation mode. And then we're there.
Still not in presentation mode?
No.
Now.
Yeah, now it is.
Now, yes.
Bingo.
Good. Thanks, Stine. Thanks, Camilla, for the introduction and the invitation. So I'm gonna get us started here, and Stine will take over. Anna was talking about a project that has been running for some time, and we were invited to talk a bit because we are starting a new project. Started just a month and a half ago on science-based policies for a sustainable European agri, food and land use system. So it's a 3-year project involving University of Copenhagen, Utrecht University and Wageningen as well, funded by the Novo Nordisk Foundation. And the center of the project is really about understanding relations between policies, development and diffusion of new solutions, technical as well as changes in practices in relation to agri-food and land use, and think about what our knowledge about the role of policies and technologies and the interactions between them then means for the way that we look forward when in terms of transition. So how do we model pathways towards more sustainable agri-food and land use systems? And the reason that we need this project, I guess, is partly, at least, illustrated in this figure here, which basically demonstrates that agriculture is really a key driver of our problems with staying within the planetary boundaries. Right? So this is from a paper in 2017, Campbell and colleagues, that identifies agriculture as a main or a significant driver of both land system change, freshwater use, climate change, and perhaps first of all, biodiversity loss. So they estimate that agriculture is responsible for 80% of biodiversity loss. So it's very substantial. There's no updated account since this 2017 paper on the role of agriculture in relation to the planetary boundaries. But the aggregated impact of humans on the Earth have, of course, been worsening since then. So we have no reasons to believe that agriculture shouldn't play a significant role for that today. Yeah, and then we can go to the next slide, Stine. So despite this sort of deteriorating state, agri-food and land use systems that respect planetary boundaries are not impossible, right? Even for a growing population. Yeah. So this is the first piece of good news, right? So that there is actually opportunities for staying within the planetary boundaries. Yeah. The issue, of course, is that this requires radical changes in production and consumption patterns. So you see on the right-hand side of this so-called U-turn figure, the different things that we need to do something about, right? Dietary changes, etc. If we are to actually have a food system that is within planetary boundaries. Yeah. Next. The second piece of good news is that we actually today have very extensive knowledge on the policy options, sort of more at the meta level for mitigating climate change, enhancing biodiversity, and securing sustainable food and biomass production within the planetary boundaries. Right? So this is, for example, coming out in this food systems economics commission report that came out last year, which sort of at this meta level outlines what we need to do, right? And if we sort of know that, right, then we can start modeling what the transition pathways towards sustainable agri-food and land use systems could actually look like. Yeah? So this is the second reason for good news. And the third one is on the next slide, which is that we actually have some, you say, at the more strategic policy making level, some key publications that really put forward an ambitious, relatively ambitious goals for transitioning agri-food and land use systems. So the farm to fork strategy, a few years old now, but was quite progressive in many aspects. And then last year we had the outcome of this so-called strategic dialogue on the future of EU agriculture, which basically took a lot of different stakeholders, core actors from the agri-food system, and asked them to develop a sort of outlook for what we need to do in order to arrive at a future sustainable agriculture system. Yeah. So there are also at the more strategic policy level a lot of good intentions of what should happen to the whole agri-food and land use system. So that's maybe the end of the good news, because if we then move to what then actually sort of happens on the ground, things start to look maybe a bit more sketchy. So this strategic dialogue was initiated because the EU wanted to develop a new vision for agriculture and food, which was published a few months ago, yeah? And where the outcome of the strategic dialogue was perhaps quite progressive. The new vision is a bit less so. A lot of focus on cutting red tape, on ensuring competitiveness, and less in terms of what needs to happen to actually stay within the planetary boundaries. If you press one more time, Stine, we'll see some pictures here coming from a recent JRC report that's called Delivering the EU Green Deal, that basically measures progress towards the targets set out in the Green Deal for the various different areas that the European Green Deal covers. Right? And one of them is relating to agriculture. And this is clearly an area where acceleration is needed. So the report shows that 70% of the targets will not be met unless we see that there's substantial acceleration in the progress towards them. Yeah. So I guess the two main points is that sort of we have good intentions on the strategic level, right? But we have insufficient implementation. Yeah. So overall, agri-food is still really lacking behind. And then next slide, Stine. Thank you. Okay, so if we are to understand why this is actually the case, right? So why is it that we see insufficient implementation? Then our suggestion is that this has a lot to do with the very large heterogeneity of agri-food and land use systems in Europe. And this is what this graph and this map here illustrates in different ways, right? This agriculture looks very differently in different parts of Europe, right? So in other words, we have this extensive knowledge on these, what we call these meta-level policy options for sustainable agri-food and land use systems, but we have a very big gap in understanding how science-based EU-level policies can be implemented in ways that account for these varying national contexts, right? And this has two main implications. One is that there's resistance from member states, which makes it difficult to commit to ambitious EU agri-food and land use policies, right? So when we have negotiations in Brussels, right, member states, they come with very different interests, right? Which makes it difficult to agree on ambitious policies. And the second one is that then when EU policies are decided, right, they might be watered down through the ways they are implemented at the national level, right? So you might implement something or you might decide something in Brussels, right? But then the effects are watered down through the national implementation forms. Right? And the aggregated effect is then we have insufficient progress on the ground.
Yes. Thank you, Teis. I'm going to take over here because Teis has mentioned implementation a couple of times, and I'll pick up from there because policy implementation is one of the phenomena that we are going to be looking more into in the SEAL project in order to better understand agri-food and land use policy and governance. And policy implementation has been an interest of mine for some time, and it's what I'll be working on in SEAL, but I've also been working on it sort of outside of that project. And I want to share a little bit on this theme because Teis and I thought it's a nice little snippet of the project to zoom in on because it invites for a lot of there's a lot of room for geographical thought when we talk about policy implementation, particularly in domains that are characterized by multi-level governance, such as agri-food and land use. And just sort of to get on the same page, when we talk about policy implementation, I keep this relatively broad notion in mind. So I'm thinking about the broad process between the establishment of an apparent intention on the part of government to do something or to stop doing something and the ultimate impact in the world of action. So this was something that Teis was also alluding to, this difference between intention and impact. And clearly in sort of agri-food and land use policies, we see that intention exists, particularly at sort of broader strategic level, but the impact is lacking in many places. And we think that one way of trying to understand this tension is to understand policy implementation better. You can address this in many other ways too, but here we'll talk about implementation. And so one empirical motivation to think about implementation is this tension between strategic intention and actual impact on the ground. But I think there are also another empirical motivation to really think more about policy implementation, which links more to sort of contemporary politics and political debate more generally. And basically, we talk about sort of, a lower or a lessened political currency in implementation compared to other political processes. So Hudson et al. 2019 have this quite nice quote. They argue that policymakers are more likely to get credit for the policy that's passed than for the implementation problems that have been avoided. And I think this really alludes to an incentive structure within contemporary politics that favors policy formation over, for instance, implementation. So a second empirical sort of reason to spend more time on trying to understand this. There's also, I think, a more classic scholarly reason to think more about policy implementation, which is, I took one article here by Flanagan and Uyara, but who, back in 2016 argued that one of the major dangers in innovation policy studies, and I think you could argue also for transition, sort of sustainability transitions policy studies, is that we talk strangely little about policy implementation. And this article being almost 10 years old, I think very little has happened, which I think really should encourage us to think more about implementation. So there is also a scholarly reason to do that. And luckily, we don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel or sort of start from scratch, because public policy research and political scientists more generally have spent a lot of time thinking about implementations and reasons why intention and outcome don't always line up. And in trying to think about this, I'm approaching it at the moment, through sort of 3 classic explanations that I just wanted to run through with you here. And I think it begins to open up another type of questions, another way of thinking about governance when we look at these classic explanations. So basically, we talk about the top-down, bottom-up, and outside-in. And top-down explanations really began to emerge in the 70s, when scholars were very frustrated with what they called policy failure. And basically, they found that intentions were set in governance, but something completely different happened on the ground. So similar to what Teis has outlined previously. But basically, this explanation argues that the policy made by centrally located political mandates is distorted during the process of implementation. And basically what they explore is what happens to the intention of a policy as it moves through the public administration. So they're very focused on the public administration. That's their sort of unit of analysis. And what they find is that internal processes within the public administration, so even though intentions are developed in one place, a policy moves to other places in the public administration, and as that shift happens from one agency to another, there's a sort of a translation risk. So Pressman and Wildowski talk about the implementation chain, and they say if there's a lot of nodes on the chain, every time a translation happens, things can go wrong, basically. And they argue that there's a really high likelihood that things will go wrong. So they say every time, as it moves through the public administration, the intention changes and also the outcome changes. But
about 2 minutes. Sorry, Stine. You got
that's
about
fine.
2 minutes.
I think that'll be fine. Outside influences. The argument basically is that interest groups, they don't stop at the policy formation phase. They're both invited in, and they actively take part in trying to shape the sort of life of a policy also when it's implemented. In the 80s, then a sort of a challenging theory developed, bottom-up explanations pioneered by Michael Lipsky. And basically what he argued was that the intention of policy is also shaped by the public administration or the frontline workers that interpret policy in their everyday practices. So they are the people that really bridge the state and citizens. And what they really talk about is that public administration are shaped, practices are shaped in public administration. So they talk a little bit about sort of individual subjectivities, but they really talk about that public administrations are places where there's a lack of resources and often competing ideas about what should happen. And that creates a particular working environment for these people. And so they use their discretionary power and autonomy to navigate this environment. And often that shapes a set of practices that also has an impact on what actually happens on the ground in the end. The final classic explanation is sort of the outside-in explanations, and those really take us outside of public administration. These ideas say that policy implementation is not only dependent on what happens within the public administration, it's also hugely dependent on the target group, so the people that we want to change the behavior of. And we can't assume that they want to or that they necessarily have an ability to comply. And some of this research points to very varied motivations, capability, incentives that drive the behavior of a target group. Okay, so what does it mean to begin to think about policy implementation? Well, first of all, it highlights an extended range of actors that are valuable to look at. So street-level bureaucrats, civil servants, policy target groups, and we see some of these themes emerging in transition studies already. There's also an extended range of activities that are valuable to consider. So suddenly if we begin to take on these different classes, we're also very much concerned with the everyday actions, routines, and practices of, for instance, street-level bureaucrats or the target group. And time also becomes much more expanded. Our attention becomes focused on a much greater time period, because interpretive flexibility of the policy is kind of reduced at multiple points in the life of this policy, in a sense. So in thinking about the theme of today of governance, one of our ideas in SEAL and in approaching agri-food policy and land use policy is to say that, maybe with a greater focus on policy implementation, we will be able to think in different ways about the politics of transition governance, basically. Yeah, I'll end there.
All right, thank you. Also, thank you for staying in time. This was also hugely interesting. Once again, I want to encourage everyone to put their questions into the Q&A box. But Victoria, I can see you in the chat. I will refer to that in a moment. But I think for now, I will use chair's prerogative and get us started with a question for both of you. I mean, both of you in a way, you spoke about this matter of outcomes and about implementation on the ground. Stine, of course, in your project, and Anna, also you spoke about these value tensions and then a related using that as related dynamics. So I'm kind of interested methodologically, how would you recommend to get at that? Because motivations is something that I have been finding it very interesting in the past, but I always end up with kind of a box when I'm at the human, because there's only so much they will tell me and I can only get so much of their motivations and what drives them and all of that, much as I know it's a very important matter. So kind of wondering, both in your project and perhaps in your experience, Anna, how you would recommend emerging researchers or anyone that's interested in those matters to go about this in terms of methodology.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I did see some interesting parallels between the two presentations, even though the scales and focus were different, particularly around the kind of the black box of decision making and what happens in the rooms when the tricky decisions are made, and that's really hard to be present at as researchers in often confidential settings, or certainly not necessarily open decision-making processes. And how do we get that to be more transparent, or at least understand a bit better what that can do? And certainly what we're doing in Naturescapes and in the Cultivate project, which I didn't talk about today, which is around food, which also has some resonance with the other presentation, is building like collaborative networks and involving those stakeholders in the research. So they're partners. So we have municipalities in the Cultivate project, for example, and we have food sharing initiatives in the project as partners, which gets access, allows us access. And so you have to have the motivation that you talked about, I think, Camilla, as a kind of starting point. But then you also have to have access to that, and how you negotiate that depends on relations between you and those people who are in those tricky situations, who often are, allocated jobs which may have changed in terms of competency needs or special capability arenas. And and recognizing their challenges too, and actually the fact that these are really tricky issues that people haven't really got to grips with at the policy design stage. That's why it's still an issue at implementation. But yes, it's a tricky one.
Stine, did you want to comment?
Sure, it's really my headache at the moment, so thank you for just banging on that.
Putting my finger on it, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great. No, I mean, it's hugely difficult, of course. And I think for me, I mean, right now I'm quite stuck in these three different approaches to implementation, my top-down, bottom-up, and outside-in. And I think, you know, top-down is maybe, we see that already now when we try to do often qualitative research on sort of the politics of policy processes. Those are similar methods. Try to get interviews, try to sit in meetings if you can. But I mean, you're never going to really be a fly on the wall. I mean, that's very difficult. And then the sort of bottom up, those classic studies are sort of more anthropological in nature. So it's really spending a lot of time in public, you know, with on the side of civil servants and trying to understand what their world is like. So I guess that's an option. But then I think it gets very tricky when we talk about target groups and sort of where the policy kind of comes to live. In a sense, some of the research that I've read is much more survey based, so it's trying to understand perceptions and motivations through that. But I think it's hugely difficult, and I am that is a headache.
Yeah, I think we're staying with this issue between policy, I guess, design and then policy implementation. Victoria, you added this question about, okay, what is the kind of understanding of consideration of actually bad policy design? So, because you're saying, okay, it could be that some policies simply do not include the plurality of values and interests of those target groups. So, is there anything that you would maybe add on this issue of bad design in terms of policy, and then emerging tensions with regard to different target groups? Either of you. Or Teis.
So I'm just trying to find the question, sorry.
It's the lowest, at least in my box, it's the one on the bottom. So it's basically a question around a mismatch with the actual interests of the target groups. Or
Just very briefly, I think that actually the literature is full of research on bad policy making. Yeah, so we have a colleague, a political scientist colleague, who always talks about how there's nothing in particular in agri-food on successful policies. It's everything is about how policy fails. Yeah, so I think maybe we are actually, that's his argument. We are missing that, and we have so much about what doesn't work, but little knowledge about what actually works.
I think moving on to a question from Christian here to Anna that I also find very interesting. How would you say what is a way of constructively dealing with conflicting values? Because they're you know, rarely you got it coming up that everybody agrees on something. So how can you actually deal with that constructively rather than it then hampering development or actually not supporting deep structural change?
Yeah, so I think that the North Bull Island case was really trying to illustrate that to some extent in a partial and provisional way, because these things are ongoing. And so the notion of resolving conflicts once and for all in a dynamic system is unlikely to be successful, right? So we have to accept that there are dynamic environments. The landform in North Bull Island is changing its shape and its formation and its interactions with other species, including humans. So in that context, the site manager is crucial linchpin. And in our interactions with him, it was clear that his view was, nobody likes me, I upset everyone, because he's trying to keep everybody happy. So the dogs are allowed in one place at certain times. They're allowed on a lead in other places. They're banned from other places, but they're giving space to those different value uses of the environment. And then, you know, decisions around whether you protect a single species of plant and try and exclude all other forms of species and things was managed in a middle way, if you like. So removing humans, but not necessarily removing the ecosystem species that were there around that very rare plant. And what he has is incredibly strong relationships with those who visit the space on a daily basis, often, as well as the botanists and the planning officers that visit the site for other reasons, who see it differently and have these different values assigned to it. But that's an ongoing process. So he's managing this dynamic bundle of values, and yet some people are unhappy at some points. But that's really the crux of the matter, I think, and us fundamentally relational in that sense.
Yeah, quite kind of similar actually, but probably also like moving on from what you said. What would you say in terms of ensuring continued participatory governance? So I mean, and also in terms of geography, because often you get outsiders to a particular geography actually commenting the most and feeling most passionate about it, right? Especially when we have these online tools of communicating with each other. How would you kind of get around that? I mean, you just talked about obviously speaking with the dog walkers yourself or your colleague, and being there. But and I think in general with governance, like with participation, ensuring this kind of engagement over time and for over longer term, and making people come back and.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge, and there's very little support from a resource side for ongoing participation processes in an Irish context currently. However, there's a really strong NGO grassroots community organisations bodies in different ways, whether it's the Tidy Towns organisations, whether it's the Coast Watch volunteers. There are lots of different groupings who also continue to provide input into processes that support almost an absence of resource allocation from formal public sector kind of interventions. And those key roles like the site manager within that and how they interact with these different groupings is crucial. One thing we're doing in North Bull Island to try and sort of touch on what you mentioned there around non-local kind of imaginaries of North Bull Island is we're experimenting with a kind of Instagram analysis of images, visual representations of North Bull Island, which are posted on social media as a means which also shape and influence people's imaginaries of what North Bull Island is there for and what it does for plants and people. So yeah, I haven't really got to grips with that data. We haven't done it yet. We're in the process of designing the approach to do that and combining that then with more survey kind of based research of users of it to see what the differences are between those kind of not necessarily local, they may well be local people posting, but also others doing that. So it's an important point, and certainly we would say with imaginaries that they are formed not just by proximity in a territorial bounded space, but also by memories, childhood experiences which may be in different places, which also affect how you then look at somewhere like North Bull Island.
I think connected to this, and since we're also looking to reflect on how we understand nature, and some would both refer to nature-based solutions, right? I'm wondering, I mean, this term, it really has to some extent entered policy making also. And do you see this as is this kind of a success? And also, or would you see, is there to some extent a washing down of this term as well? It's kind of this typical policy wash, right? It stays in there and it just kind of becomes broader and broader and washed out, and the definition of what it actually really is, rather than just everything related to environmental measures or anything like that. How helpful at this point would you both say it really is?
Yeah, I mean, the whole question of solutionism, I suppose, is a challenge. And I think probably it is appealing to particularly, say, local governments in an Irish context, because it seems to be quite common sense, if you say. We're using nature to solve a problem that we have. Therefore, the terminology of nature-based solution kind of is easy to comprehend in that sense, although not in a very specific context. I mean, it just raises lots of questions, doesn't it, about a solution for whom, for what, in what context, in what time frame. It doesn't resolve the tricky issues, but it allows and has been sort of taken on by policymakers in an Irish context because they feel that people want them to be seen to be solving problems, and that's what they feel that the public wants them to do, even though we know the solutions that these natural interventions create are bounded in terms of their capacities to create the solution that we want them to have. And so there are uncertainties around the kind of effectiveness for these kinds of tools without a shift in the way that we're thinking about nature itself. So it's kind of continuing a strong engineering approach to nature to society challenges and interactions, which and engineers have been incredibly successful in building lots of great buildings and bridges and infrastructures and all of those things, but they don't necessarily have the broader picture of these different aspects that need to be considered. So it's a double-edged sword. It has helped, I think, in terms of communicating to people in places what these interventions are trying to do, solve a problem. But it's not really getting to grips with what nature can do for us and what employing nature in a very instrumental way does to these non-instrumental values that it also holds for people.
Mm-hmm. Stine, I think I'm going to slightly reframe that actually for yourself and in relation to agriculture, and I think that we will also wrap up after this. So kind of this nature-based solution, or this idea of working with nature to solve issues, and then of course agriculture being highly industrialized to some extent, right? How do you think that fits together, and do you think there's any scope for shifting a perspective within those who actually practice agriculture or do agriculture on an everyday basis for this kind of more broader, or maybe actually moving back to a working with nature kind of perspective?
Teis, also feel free to jump in if you sit on qualified knowledge on this. I think I think those thoughts are there, but it's not my impression that they're very that they exist, but I don't think they sit on finance or power or. I think to me it sounds like it's a story that we want to talk about a lot, but I don't see that that's what's happening, and I think there are many reasons for that. Yeah.
So it's kind of a discourse, but not so much substance at the moment right now. Yeah, Teis, did you want to add something?
No, I think these kind of developments remain quite marginal, I would say, right? Unfortunately, yeah. Not that they're completely absent, but they are quite marginal, and they are also very marginal in policy making. Yeah.
But it will be interesting to see in your research actually how that also turns out in the different geographies that you referred to. That would be, I think that's a very, very exciting aspect of that project, and I'm very, very much looking forward to hearing more about it. Well, I think at this point we're going to wrap it up, and I can only say thank you, all three of you, so much for these very, very interesting impulse talks. Has been very interesting. Thank you to those who ask questions. Please do continue and engage. And obviously our next webinar will be on the 22nd of May with Mary Lauren and Gavin Bridge. And you can find the details about that, and also opportunity to register on the website, and there's also the LinkedIn page of the Geography of Sustainability Transitions community now that we ask you to follow. And I think at this point I would say thank you all very much again, and goodbye. Have a good afternoon.